Hi guys, a question that often comes back is where do you get your ideas from? Or in the case of this video specifically, where do you get ideas for your stories? It's something that I'm asked once in a while. Although, bear in mind, I'm not really a writer. I'm just a guy who did a few comic book stories. So that's pretty much the extent of my professional writing resume, if you will. So take what I say with that in mind. I will talk specifically about two examples. I will talk about where I got the idea for the League of Monsters story, Holy War, and I'll talk also where I got the idea for the I Paladin story featuring the Paladin. But before I can talk about the Holy War story, I guess I have to give a bit of context with the League of Monsters. Essentially, I was watching a film with a few friends. We were at the theater, and we were watching a film called Wolf Creek. It has absolutely nothing to do with monsters or anything like that, unless you count the human monsters who pretty much massacre people in the film. If you're underage, don't go watch that film. It's not for you. And so essentially, we were watching that film Wolf Creek, and holy crap, I was a bit bored. It was a lot for a long stretch of the film. Not much happens, although you do see some really nice shot of Australia. So visually, there's some really beautiful landscapes in there. But for a long time, not much really happens. So my mind was wondering, as it often does when I'm bored and don't really know what else to do. Essentially, I started thinking about the Flashback Universe, but also what could we add to the Flashback Universe that we didn't have already? We had already some Avengers, we had the Fantastic Four, but we were missing something pretty important. We were missing the X-Men. So I kept on thinking and thinking, okay, what could be our equivalent of the X-Men in the Flashback universe? And then I kept on thinking about the tagline for the X-Men, like feared and hunted by those they try to protect. And essentially that pretty much became the backbone of the idea I had for the League of Monsters. At the time, I wasn't really calling it the League of Monsters. I think I tried to suggest to Jim a lame name like the Fallen Ones or something like that. But luckily, Jim got a much better idea than I did. So as I kept on thinking about the idea, I thought, okay, who could be feared by those they try to protect? And then the idea was, holy crap, let's make a group with the Dracula, with the Frankenstein monster, with a werewolf, with an angel, with a mummy, and why not throw in a demon or two? Why not? And then I thought, who could be the one keeping all those guys in line? Who could be the Professor X of the group? And of course, it had to be a priest. Who else but a priest could, maybe using various incantation or rituals, keep those guys in line? So that pretty much became the original idea I had for that. So as soon as I got back home from the theater, I took a pencil and some paper and I made a whole bunch of sketches with various characters. And then with Photoshop, I did I did put some of those sketches together. I like the one you're looking at right now, and I sent that to Jim right away with probably a paragraph or two to explain what I was trying to do. And then I guess my madness was contagious because very quickly Jim sent me a reply back, and he sent me a bunch of ideas about how we could make actually those monsters teenagers instead, and how the priest that actually controls them or is in charge of them could be the legendary Longinus, the evil Roman soldier who killed poor Jesus 2,000 years ago. So, and that's pretty much how it started. And also, I guess Jim was also possessed because he also sent me that an awesome presentation with what became known as the Last Angel. And holy crap, I was hooked. Essentially, I did a video about that. But essentially, what you're seeing is the video is not quite what Jim sent me. Jim sent me a file with the story and some visuals, and essentially I sent him some visual back, and then we made what became our first flashback backstory with the Last Angel. So what I thought at first would be the Frankenstein monster actually became the son of Frankenstein. We called him Victor. Obviously, we named him after the scientist who created the Frankenstein monster. And then the angel, which was really a non-specific angel that I chose, actually became the Last Angel. And Jim thought that the idea of using Dracula was a bit overplayed, so he actually took my idea of using Dracula and instead decided to create the man-made vampire who became a butterfly, which is, I have to admit, I don't think I've seen any vampire like her. So it gave us a pretty unique and fresh angle on the whole vampire phenomena. Of course, then we had the Black Prowler, whom you saw a couple of times in a few of our comics. And there was Sandwalker, whom I've tried to recreate in this universe online. I wasn't quite there, but it's close enough. And last but not least, Longinus, who pretty much is the Professor X of the group. And originally we were planning to do only one stories with each characters that we created. Essentially we created so many characters for the Flashback Universe that we figured that if we did like one story for each, it would take us like 10 years to do stories with all those characters. But I really enjoyed the League of Monsters. I thought Jim did a really good job fleshing out those characters. And so I wanted to make another story with those characters. And at the time, we were trying to pitch stories to Zuda. Essentially, Zuda was a website where you could submit a comic. So every month, Zuda would choose 10 comics. And amongst those 10 comics, people would vote to choose one comic that would be published for like a year or something like that. We had already submitted one story to Zuda. Sadly, we were chosen amongst 10 other comics, but we didn't win, sadly. So as I was looking for ideas to publish something through Zuda, I couldn't help but go back to the League of Monsters. I really enjoyed those characters, and I really thought that Jim did a great job with those characters. At some point, Jim had suggested that we could call them the Legion of Monsters. In the 70s, Marvel had published like a one-shot comic that was called the Legion of Monsters, but they had published nothing of the kind since then. So I'm pretty sure that the copyright was up for grabs. Essentially, if you don't know, publishers have to publish a new series with the same title every few years, or they run the risk of losing the trademark. And since it had been like 20 years since Marvel published any Legion of Monsters comics, well, we thought, well, why not call them the Legion of Monsters? But of course, as fate would have it, like the very month we got that idea, Marvel decided to publish like an essential comic called the Legion of Monsters. But all was good. We went with the League of Monsters instead, and it worked fine. So as I was scratching my head, wondering who the enemies of the League of Monsters could be, I couldn't help but go to the evil Nazis. Nazis are the most fun villains out there for multiple reasons. The main reasons being that you don't really have to explain their motivation. Like they're Nazis, and that's all people need to know that they're evil and they're evil. You don't have to explain why they're evil. Just the fact of who they are, that's more than enough to justify that they are evil. Essentially, I'd been trying to come up with an evil Nazi group that was more or less an odd mixture of the Thunderbolts, the Masters of Evil, and probably something else I can't recall right now. But so essentially, I was trying to come up with those evil characters, and essentially I came up with a version of them during World War II and a version of them that we could use in more modern time. So using those characters allowed me to create a story that pretty much spawned through various ages, and also it created some built-in history within the comic and some built-in backstory for all those characters. And also there's all those myths and rumors around how the evil Adolf Hitler was going after mystical artifacts like the Spear of Destiny and stuff like that. And since we had Longinus in the story, obviously Longinus is linked with the Spear of Destiny. So all of that made sense and kind of was linked even before I even started writing the first word. So again, it gave the characters and the story a lot of built-in backstory that I thought gave it more depth. But then I kept on wondering again. Okay, we have the evil elite German soldiers. Who else could be the antagonist for our League of Monsters? And at some point, I had an epiphany. It had to be the church. My original idea was to actually make the church going after the League of Monsters. Obviously, the church would want to anything with demons and monsters and all that stuff. The church would probably have like an elite squad force that would go after those evil monsters. But sadly, Jim said no to that, and I can't really blame him. His wife would probably have kicked him out of a very happy home if he had done such heresy. But all was good still, because essentially all we really needed to do was create this fake character called the Cardinal Sin, who would be like some evil counterpart to the church. So all was good. So essentially, we created some sort of evil church led by the Cardinal Sin, and his elite troopers were the U-bolts, which made a ton more sense. Essentially, why would the church use evil Nazis? It made more sense to have like this evil counterpart to the church that actually didn't mind using evil henchmen like the U-bolts. So again, for the U-bolts, I was trying to come up with various characters at some point. Essentially, I pretty much started creating them separately, and then at some point, I think I put them together and sent like a handful of them to Jim, and that Jim somehow seemed to like those characters. So whenever I could get the chance, I would use them either in the background or something for a story. Essentially, I think the very first time we see them is the Paladin story. We see them in a few flashbacks, and we even see them in a few frames on the walls. I'll try to show you in a bit. And again, for each U-bolt, I tried to create what would be a World War II counterpart and a more modern counterpart. So essentially, whenever I got the chance, I was trying to come up with new characters, either new heroes we could use, or new villains that we could use against those characters. So whenever I had a bunch of sketches of roughs that I thought were worth using, I would send them to Jim, and we would bounce back and forth ideas about those characters. Ursa here is probably the only U-bolt who doesn't have a World War II counterpart. And for the Paladin story, it started in a very silly way. Essentially, I love domino masks. Essentially, masks not unlike the one you're seeing right now. And so I was trying to come up with a character that was using such a mask. And that's pretty much how the whole thing started. That's pretty much what triggered me wanting to make a Paladin story. Because as I was designing the character, I was trying to come as I was designing the character, I was trying to come up also with the backstory, who the character was, why was he the way he was, and so I started thinking, okay, maybe this could be like the Bucky equivalent to the Paladin. So maybe in World War II he was the Paladin's sidekick or something, and now he's a much older guy because it's been a while. And also, again, it could give me the opportunity to explore both the past and the present within the same story. So we could have a story where we see what's actually happening, and then with various flashbacks that would flesh out the story, flesh out the characters, and flesh out the whole background of those characters, and give them a sense of history, so to speak. So after coming up with a design that I kind of liked, I started being like possessed, and then I started roughing out the story, roughing out the story idea that I had in mind. So I spent like the next 3 days working like a madman on those rough drawings, and essentially I would put in dialogues as placeholders, but essentially I spent like 3 days, maybe 3.5 days, putting together that story. It's a little hard to explain because that story pretty much came out on its own. And it pretty much grew organically from my germ of an idea of essentially just having a guy in a domino mask being the paladin's sidekick during the war, and it bloomed from there. And then I put the whole thing together, sent Jim a CBR version for him to watch, and Jim liked it. So we decided to make that our next Flashback Universe comics at the time. And although this was a Paladin comic, one thing that I've always enjoyed from comics was how you would see guest stars in comics. Like you could see a Captain America comic and have the Avengers guest stars within the comic. And ironically enough, in the movies, they started doing that also, like in the last Captain America Civil War. The Avengers end up being a pretty important part of the story. And within the story, I would always try to put in some backstory, quote unquote. Like you can see on the walls various illustration that I'd done either for other comics, or even sometimes it's only the character design that I submitted to Jim at some point that I ended up using just as a frame on the wall. And you can see just behind Saturn Knight, there is a picture of the Vanguard versus the evil U-bolts that the evil Jim covered with balloons. Can you believe it? But I think I ended up using it in some other comics, so it was all good. So again, you can see on the various walls, whenever I got the chance, I would try to use various images that I done, either for the previous Flashback Universe comics we had done at the time, or even some new images that I did specifically for the story. Like you can see behind our friend Saturn Knight, you can see a picture of various Vanguard characters fighting a whole bunch of different characters, one of which is the Frankenstein monster, which is, spoiler alert, essentially this was a plant that I'd put in there that kind of fits with the reveal that we get later in the story. And also it allowed me to do an homage to an Avenger story or an Avenger cover that I love. Essentially, you had Thor fighting the evil Frankenstein monster, and which kind of did fit with that story. And here we have an idea that I'm not sure if it was suggested by Jim or by Chad Bowers, who contributed to the comic. Essentially, the idea was to comment a bit about the Ultimate Captain America that was published at the time. Which is also another thing is that what started with a simple idea of, okay, let's create a character with a domino mask, and then just trying to give him some backstory, essentially became a tale that pretty much spawned through the eras, and that pretty much became a commentary of how comics evolved and how characters evolved through the ages, and how the more modern version of the characters were sometimes a bit overkill, just as the characters. So what started as a pretty simple story became, in a very organic way, became layered with a lot of commentary about what the state of comic was at the time and the direction that comic did seem to take at the time. How comics were sadly on a path of trying to become greedy, and a lot of characters pretty much became just a pale imitation of the Wolverine, which is something that pretty much started in the early 90s and that continued all the way through most of the 2000s. Although by some sweet irony, Marvel decided to kill Wolverine because they don't own the movie rights to the character, but that's another story. And at first, I think I wanted to call the character the Grim Rapier, but then I think it's Chad Bowers who came up with the name Killstroke, which was even much better if we take into account the subtext of the story. And again, essentially the story allowed me to explore the past with World War II, but also the present, and to show the kind of the contrast between the two. And essentially, with the Flashback Universe comics, I was always trying to go against the grain, where every comic were becoming darker, especially even in terms of coloring. Like the coloring in comics became really, really dark. I was trying to go the opposite direction by going back to more hopeful characters and more brightly colored characters, but also brightly colored comics. Essentially, if anything was darker was the background, I would often go with some fairly dark, fairly gray background, so that the brightly colored character would actually pop out from those backgrounds. Obviously, there would be exceptions. Sometimes I would need some brighter element in the backgrounds for various reasons, but as a rule, I would try to have the characters pop from the background. And also would try to use those vignettes, essentially that were more or less a pin-up showing up the character, but also with essentially the backstory of the character, more or less around the character on the same page. So in one page, I could pretty much give a resume of the character's history since whenever. In this case, since World War II. So you could start with the Paladin saving his life in World War II, then the Paladin leaving for the North Pole, then the Knight fighting alongside the Intruders, and obviously with the formation of the Vanguard much later. So essentially in one big splash page, I could pretty much cover the history of the character fairly quickly. But I still needed at least a few scenes to explore the actual backstory of the character, and also try to link it with the present and show sort of the contrast between the two. I'm using sort of a variation of a parallel structure between the past and the present that's often used in storytelling. And essentially, Killstroke was more or less a wink to all the over-designed characters that we've been seeing since at least the early or mid 90s, and also all those designs with uber spikes and all those things. Here we have our friend the Knight, who calls the Paladin Frank. Essentially, as you know, the Paladin is the Frankenstein monster. Sadly, there's a lot of people who don't seem to realize or understand that Frankenstein is actually the name of the scientist. The monster actually has no name. He is known as the Frankenstein monster. But a lot of people seem to think that Frankenstein is the name of the monster, so we went with it. And essentially, one of the components used to create the Frankenstein monster was electricity. In some contexts, it was lightning. In other contexts, it was like electric heels. But it made kind of sense to try to use electricity to try to revive him, and even make it so that electricity might have some healing properties with him. And paladins in some contexts, like in Dungeons and Dragons, have some sort of healing abilities. So I thought, seeing how the character is linked with electricity, electricity could be used by him to heal others also, thanks to his unique genetics or something like that. And anyone who played this universe online a bit probably knows by now that electric powers are used as a healing power. So I guess I was ahead of my time at the time. And essentially, we're going to come back to the parallel narratives, where essentially we're going to go from the fight with Killstroke to the time when Paladin essentially broke the arm of the evil German soldiers instead of ending him. And we come back to the present, where essentially in the parallel narratives, the same thing happens to our friend Killstroke. And Chad linked the two scenes with the dialogues, which was brilliant. So here we have Paladin, who's about to use electricity and his unique genetics to bring back his friend the Knight, or to heal him. But the Knight has been there long enough to know that his time has come. That he probably lived longer than he should have through natural means, so it was time for him to go. And also he has some friends waiting for him. He has the Crimson Cossack that we see in the background, and next to the Cossack, we see Frostfire. Next to Frostfire, we have the Golden Age Atomic Tommy, and we have the Golden Age Wildcard, who's all waiting for him in the afterlife. And at first, I was going to end my story on the death of the knight, but then one of the comments we had was that a lot of our stories were had either a bittersweet ending or ended a little bit in a grim way. So I thought let's try to have a more hopeful ending instead. I know that having the funeral of the knight is not all that hopeful, but essentially it leads us to the revelation of who the paladin is. And essentially I lifted a panel from Jack Kirby, which has been reused also by many artists through the years to retell the origin story. And again, we get to the big splash page where we can actually tell some of the backstory of the character in just one page. So we can see the creation of the monster, how the monster was feared and hated by people who didn't understand him, how he tried to create himself a wife, a bride, and sadly it didn't go very well, and how he decided to go up north to end his days, or so he thought. And then up north, we would see essentially where the paladin would get his uniform, his costume, and he would be approached by Longinus, who would essentially try to give him a chance to come back to civilization. But through Longinus, he would learn about that there were special beings or super beings, and so he would craft himself an identity that would allow him to hide his true identity and would allow him to come back into the world as the paladin. And here we have a quick montage of what happened to Killstroke, and now I was even able to sneak in the Crimson Cossack on the wall. And essentially, you remember that I wanted to end on a more hopeful note, so instead of ending with the death of the Knight of King City, I would instead end on the mantle of a character taking up the mantle of the Knight. So instead of just ending on the death of the Knight of King City, I would instead end on the hopeful note of the guy would actually pick up the mantle and try to replace him now that he's gone. So essentially, we end with the end of a legend and the beginning of a new one. So in short, as I was trying to come up with a new character for the Flashback Universe, and as I was trying essentially to create a character that would use a domino mask for reasons, essentially the more I thought about the backstory and the more I thought about who this character was, and the more the story took shape in my mind, until at some point I committed that to paper, showed it to Jim, and we had our next Flashback Universe comic at the time. So I hope you enjoyed this little retelling of how I came up with those two stories. Essentially, in a short, there's no one way to create a story. There's as many ways to create stories as there are people creating stories, and this is just how I created those two stories. So don't think that I'm telling you that this is how you have to do it. That's not it at all. Sometimes the inspiration for stories comes from the most bizarre place, and coming up with the story is not with the idea or the story. That's not the hard part. It takes just a few seconds to come up with an idea. The hard part is committing that story to paper and actually following through with it. I often see that with aspiring artists or aspiring writers, where they have all those ideas, but they've committed nothing to paper. It's all in their head, and that's the easy part. Having the idea doesn't take much time at all, but then taking a piece of paper and committing that idea to paper, that's where the real work is. That's what's time consuming. Like it takes you 5 minutes to come up with an idea, but then it'll take you a month, 2 months, 3 months to actually commit that idea to paper. So once you have your idea and you want to tell your story, Then roll up your sleeves because the lion's share of the work is still ahead of you. I hope you guys enjoyed this little retelling of how I came up with those stories. And thank you guys for watching. As always, it's much appreciated. And hopefully, I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.